Thanks everyone for joining today. We're super excited to have everyone. We can kind of just get started by introing ourselves and then just giving a little background on like why this topic is relevant to us. And then we'd love for everyone to go around and introduce themselves. Does that work? Cool. Alexis, do you want to kick us off?
I should have practiced my pitch. Yes. My name is Alexis Johnson Gresham. I work at a company called Brooklyn Data Co., which if you're around the LO Slack, you've probably seen Scott. We work together. I've worked in analytics for about 6 years, doing everything from investigating bad guy stuff in cybersecurity to doing marketing analytics to kind of everything in between. So that's it in a nutshell.
So I know a lot of you here, but I'm Michelle. I built out the analytics function at Billy's. So we're an e-commerce subscription company making body care products. And this topic is particularly meaningful to me because in true startup fashion, I actually spent a little over a year dual rolling and serving as the PM on the engineering team, which was really interesting. And that's really what opened my eyes to Agile and how effective it can be as a workflow and process. So now that I'm building out the data team, because I get to focus on that again, really thinking about how I can apply those components and principles to analytics. Michael, you're next on my screen. I don't know if everyone sees the same order, but maybe you could go next.
Sure. I'm Michael. I used to do a lot of work in analytics, sort of organizationally. I was running an analytics and data science team in the e-commerce space, competing directly with Michelle. But now I'm not anymore, so we can be friends, which is really nice for me. But now I'm sort of doing a bunch of different things, some entrepreneurial, doing a lot more sort of software engineering and actually like data science work, writing a lot more code, writing a lot fewer memos, which has been nice, but I also miss writing memos sometimes too. So I'm excited to learn about what y'all are doing and think through some of these important topics with y'all.
Awesome. Is Andrea next for everyone else?
Right. Oh. Sorry. Yeah. So my name is Andrea Fabri. I'm an analytics engineer. I did 2 tours of duty, being the first data lead at B2B SaaS startups, and now I am interviewing, so I kind of use this downtime to research stuff, write blogs, and also I'm interested in the whole Agile conversation because it just keeps on coming up in every interview about process and how do you incorporate data into the existing engineering practices, existing data science practices, etc., etc.
Sure.
I think we've got to go by your order, Michelle.
Oh, my order? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's not deterministic.
Caitlin, you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Caitlin Mormon. I lead the analytics team at Trove Recommerce. We do resale on behalf of large brands and retailers so they can take back products from their customers and resell it. And I lead a data team of currently 4. So I am just constantly obsessed with how to make my team more effective. And I struggle with not changing process too often, primarily. So anyway, I'm always thinking about, what works in Agile and what doesn't work in Agile and how do we make that more functional for our team and improve the outcomes with our stakeholders. So.
Awesome. Andrew Bennett.
Hi, everyone. So I am the analytics lead at Insight Partners. So it's a VC firm here in the city, in New York. So I was previously on analytics teams at a couple of startups, also here in New York. So I'm moving from the 1 to 3 person analytics team setup to a 10 to 12 person analytics team setup, and am very curious to see kind of what process and structure other people are working with, because I'm going from the wild, wild west into something that's definitely not that. So yeah.
Needs more structure. Yeah. Cool. Andrew, you're next on my screen.
Sure. I'm Andrew. I'm from Fish Analytics. So working as an analytics engineer with the team behind DBT. I'm honestly just like, I just want to hear the conversation in broad as well, because we're particularly used to doing things in a very agile way, but we're also getting some clients now that fit more of an enterprisey mold, that like just sometimes you want to get them into like an agile workflow with you as a client or with you as a consultant, but sometimes it just doesn't work. And so I kind of want to hear as well, like both the pros and some like hopefully not horror stories, but like things to avoid and like red flags.
Yeah. Cool. Walt.
Hello, my name is Walt. I lead operations strategy and analytics at Glossier, which is a company. I'm particularly interested in just how Agile can help in the new remote environment and just sort of keeping track of all the different random requests that I think have been getting lost more frequently since we left the office.
Sure. Bill, you're next on my screen.
Yeah, Bill Saltmarsh, lead the analytics and data science group for a high growth SaaS company called Pluralsight out of Utah. And my interest in this topic is based on the context of us moving to a different org structure from an analytics and data science support standpoint. And what we've been previously is my team has been viewed as sort of an extension of the functional areas of the business. And so those functional areas have been generally structure averse. So now we're moving into what is more likely to be a better context for structure. And I just kind of want to hear the pros and cons and ins and outs of this discussion.
Cool. So I assume everyone has taken a look at the amazing blog post that Michael contributed on Locally Optimistic related to this topic, but we can also kind of just share a refresher on the principles and components of Agile. Alexis, I'll let you take it away.
All right, I will drop a link in virtual events in case it's helpful to you to have a copy. You can scroll in and zoom into or refer to as we're going through things. But this is not that. Here we go. So we just wanted to do a quick touch on some of the overarching principles and kind of key vocab that goes into Agile frameworks. If you've never done much of a deep read into them, Agile is a conglomeration of a lot of different styles of project management, and it focuses on delivering value regularly and with the stakeholder involved and in mind. So as opposed to coming from a perspective of, we are the data team and we know best and these are the things we think are the most important, really engaging and interacting with key stakeholders to balance their functional expertise with our analytical expertise to really push something with impact forward as opposed to just getting things done. Some of the things you'll probably hear different people who have worked with Agile in the past mention as we go through this discussion are things like points, where you want to think about how complex a task is when you're planning, spikes for those ones that are really unknown, stories, which are just the idea that you can have a big project like setting up DBT for the first time or like implementing a BI tool, but there are lots of little bits that go into that. When you hear things like acceptance criteria, we're talking about what done looks like, but we'll probably get more into this for data in particular. Sometimes it's really talking about what good enough looks like. Done does not mean perfect. Sprints commonly are 2-week chunks of work, but it's whatever interval teams tend to agree to think about, okay, when are we going to check in on what work we have gotten done? How long will we take kind of just to have a pause to see what's been delivered, how we need to redirect, as opposed to having a giant unending block of time until something gets completed. And then finally, Agile tends to run on ceremonies or sprint rituals, which involve things like getting together with stakeholders and team members to understand what work needs to get done, how that work is going, and to show off what has got done. And then the all-important retrospective, wherein teams reflect on how things went and how they might want to change things the next time. So if I could condense all of this stuff here into a really small nutshell, again, Agile is about regularly delivering value, like something functional that stakeholders can react to, and reflecting on and iterating on that. But again, I dropped the link in the virtual events channel if you'd like to have this to reference, and there are a couple of links to some more detailed resources if you want to check them out after the call. Anything else to add, Michelle?
No. Great. Yeah. So I think similarly to the way that Michael laid it out in his blog post, it might make sense to maybe reflect on the things that we really like about Agile, the things that work for us, and then maybe get into things that don't work as well when applied to an analytics team, and maybe brainstorm collectively what solutions to that could be, those could be. So in just thinking about like what things we really like about Agile, I can kick it off with the acceptance criteria. So when I was originally leading the analytics team, I kept noticing that engineers would start working on tasks, and because the acceptance criteria wasn't written out very clearly, they would end up working on the wrong thing and spending too much time on, quote unquote, the wrong problem. And I was very resistant to being more structured in my approach for writing out acceptance criteria. I did not want to spend so much time being like this person who was writing up instructions, but at the end of the day, I mean, the proof was in the pudding. You could just tell every sprint, every ticket that was really written out exactly what the goal of this ticket is. There was no back and forth, and it was finished in a really timely and effective manner. So I'm a big fan of acceptance criteria, and I think that it also really lends itself to a analytics best practice, which is to, rather than just respond to someone's request for a data pull. So can you share with me conversion rate broken out by device type? It kind of encourages you to push, okay, why? What's the goal that you're trying to get at? Because maybe that's not even the right data that you're asking for to solve the problem you're looking to achieve. So acceptance criteria gets a +1 from me.
And if I thought about, so we're in consulting at Brooklyn Data Co. So I have both my experience at other companies, kind of seeing how to do data well, and then we're running. It's like, you could think about it like 20 different experiments, right? If we're working with 20 different companies on iterating and figuring out what works well in an organization that is more enterprisey versus one that's scrappier, one that prefers a lot of structure versus one that is seeking out structure, because I really want to get the sense that data teams are driving value. And that's what I really like about Agile, is that it kind of focuses every conversation, really related to what Michelle was saying, on the why. Like, what company objective, what goal is this going to move forward? How will we help people work faster or smarter, or know something when they need to know it? And I think having that question is super important, because not every task can be a deep exploratory task, or if it is one, we've got to try to figure out where we can put guardrails around it. So definitely being value driven is the big one for me.
Has anyone else like any positive feelings towards Agile, or things that you've seen work really well for your teams? I think in general, it requires a lot of upfront work, but it seems worth it.
Agile has allowed us to defend our needs for headcount, for our hours, to justify what work we've been doing. It's Agile because people are touching tickets all the time. If you're writing your tickets at appropriate granular level, you have really good visibility into what your teams are working on. We epic every one of our major projects, so I have clean status anytime I want to say, hey, what's your analytics team doing? Oh, look here, boom, boom, boom. I have ticket history of all my developers. I know, hey, developer X gets 120 points this is week, and that's all he's going to ever get done. So I can then plan out my work. So when someone comes to us, I can say, hey, we got 6 weeks until I'm even going to touch your work. Like,
Right.
either find another way to do it or wait 6 weeks. So like Agile has helped us a lot in those areas because we can apply that tracking methodology on top of it.
Absolutely. And that also helps to protect the analysts too, because when you can write out that they won't be able to accomplish this, there's no pressure to work overtime to get that done. It's very clearly stated that this will not fit into our capacity. So that's a really good point.
Saying no is hard. Saying no with data is a lot easier. And people are a lot more receptive to it too. If you can say them, if they push back and be like, look, I can show you my history. And it ends all conversations there. It ends all anxiety, any people complaining. Like it's a showstopper. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the stakeholders at Billy are pretty much trained to say, like, when they want to ask for something, they know, okay, this means I need to remove something from the priorities list. So takes time, but we'll get there.
I think.
What else?
I have a question. Oh, go ahead, Michael, and then I'll ask my question.
Yeah, so I'll just add one point that I think plays off both what you, Alexis, said and Michelle said, but it's a slightly different angle, which is that in my experience, it's working more on the data science side, especially like doing a lot of research. I find that it's really easy for me, and I've observed this in other people as well, to like start in on a project and then just sort of like work aimlessly for a long time. And so I think like both of the things that y'all were talking about having that, the Agile process and like some of the ceremonies actually enforce this idea of thinking about a problem really hard before you start on it, which I think can be really hard. It's actually even harder, I think, in data science world, but also like really, really important. And so that like discipline about being like, what am I actually trying to solve? What is the deliverable going to be? How am I going to know when I'm done? And how hard is it going to be? Like, I think that a lot of data scientists, especially if they come from like an academic background or like not in industry necessarily, they don't really have that. They don't always have that skill. And so I think that like the Agile process brings a lot of that rigor to data science work in a way that I think can be really hard, but really benefits from taking that step back before starting on something, thinking about like, okay, what am I actually trying to do here? And I find a lot of value in that in particular.
Yeah. That actually brings up a question that I have. So obviously during a grooming session, you'll review acceptance criteria. And so does everybody understand what we're trying to achieve with this story or this task? But for those who have operated with Agile, will you also touch on during those meetings, like some approaches to solving that problem? Will you get into nitty gritty of like what options? Because obviously with analytics, there's a million ways to solve every problem. Is that something that you'll incorporate into a grooming session, or do you kind of say, okay, we're not actually talking about how we're executing, we're just focusing on what we're trying to achieve? I know at Billy, the engineering team would get very upset if we spent too much time talking about how we were going to execute. So that was a learning for me.
You're talking about like grooming, like backlog grooming, when you're going and assigning points to a ticket. How are you not talking about what you're going to do? How do you come to an agreement and say, hey, this is 6 points, or this is 5 points, this is 7 points? How do you even come to that when you don't talk about a generalized approach? I think it's kind of essential to understanding, unless it's something, hey, build this dashboard, build this, straightforward view. You have to collaborate at least a little bit to say, hey, how can we do this? How can we get where we need to be? Obviously, depending on complexity. Right.
And I can see this sort of pushback if it's a little bit more open-ended, or if there's more than way to build a solution for the same set of acceptance criteria. So I generally try to ask, what's your vision, stakeholder? How did you imagine this getting done, but not locking into this is how it will get done. But what are some possibilities? Because that's data, right? Like you start digging into it, you might find something you did not expect, or depending on the type of problem, especially again, if it's a really open-ended one, you don't know what you're going to come up against once you start digging into it. I think there's a little bit of if you're not in grooming, like I think there's a special thing to consider when you're working with less experienced staff. like as opposed to more experienced staff, because they might need a little bit more guardrails on how do I get this done. And if we're talking a typically small data team, that can be a little bit tricky to manage from an Agile perspective. You have to lean on your seniors a little bit more, if you have them even, which some folks don't.
I think you bring up a good point. In that your team composition is going to greatly affect how your rituals are run, and how quickly you can do them, and how much time you need to spend, and how long they've been working together. So that's the benefit of Agile, is that you can adjust your processes based on your team composition to take advantage of those strengths and balance out the weaknesses. So it can be whatever you need it to be for your team, and that's the beauty of it.
I think one of the things here is that's a little bit challenging, right, is like the work that analytics teams do can vary from like software engineering on one side to like sort of data science and research on the other. And I think on the software engineering side, the way that I think about it is like the clearer that the acceptance criteria are, the less you need to spend talking about implementation, right? If you're like, you know, this table is now going to have this extra column and this is what it's going to look like you don't really need to go get into the weeds of like what SQL you're going to write. Like I agree that would be overkill. Like if you have software engineers who are capable of writing that, like they're going to be able to go figure out, and you don't really need to sit and talk about it in a discussion. However, on the other side, I think that if like the story is like, you know, figure out if, you know, do an MVP of can we predict this phenomenon effectively, right? Or something that's like much more open and broader. I think that in a grooming session, you would, for the first one, you probably wouldn't need to talk about it very much. For the second one, you really would, right? Like if you have different data scientists on the team, one might say like, oh, this is going to be this machine learning model. And others just say like, no, I was thinking about doing it this other way. And then like you would actually maybe want to have more of a discussion about that, because that's a much more sort of open-ended researchy question where the methods actually really do matter, and like different people might disagree about the right way to actually approach that problem, and there could be sort of beneficial discussion about it. So I sort of think that answering that question is related to like the type of work that you're actually looking at, and within an analytics team, it could actually vary quite a lot.
And I suppose that if you can't come to an alignment on how you're approaching a problem, then maybe it's time that more acceptance criteria is added.
Yeah,
maybe
I mean,
that's what it shows.
What I would do, right, is I would like split that off into a separate story and be like, this story is going to be propose how to answer that, and like write up an RFP on like what your proposed strategy is, and then like that has its own process for getting feedback from the rest of the team to get to alignment. And then the next story gets created, which is like, it's just like a link to that document, which then effectively is the acceptance criteria. So it's like, we're going to pull this conversation out, have one person go and do the research, come up with a proposal, and then do an asynchronous agreement on what the plan there is going to be.
That sounds great.
Do you think of refinement as the time to talk architecture, or is it like backlog refinement or backlog grooming, the time to talk architecture, or is it the time to make sure that the right kinds of things are on the backlog? Like I tend to think about that as the prioritization time. And if something is too open-ended, which you wouldn't, I guess you could get into if you went more into the, you know, how are we going to solve this? Then that makes sense to talk about there. But if you're talking strict, I don't know, nothing about Agile is strict. It's approaches. It's a mindset. It's not like we are Agile today. That's where people can get tripped up a little bit too. But I think that's where we tend to have to guide folks who are getting used to Agile for the first time, is kind of having a sense of where's the distribution of goals, because you can get into a rabbit hole on, well, how are we going to solve this when the goal for whatever that particular ritual was, you know, how did things go, or how are things going, or overall, do we need to move these 3 epics forward versus these other 2? It's a deep question. Lots of feelings there.
Yeah.
One I had coming off of, you said that the stakeholders at Billy now are pretty well trained up on, okay, there are trade-offs. I've got to push something off of the backlog.
We're a very small team, unfortunately, understaffed.
I think that's the perennial way of a lot of data teams. So how do folks look at managing expectations, or kind of training up stakeholders to something that feels relatively unfamiliar? Sometimes to me, sometimes it has felt in the past like stakeholders are looking for that magical button I ask you for data thing, you push it, out comes data product, which we know that's not how it works. So how do we train folks up on that when they're not necessarily used to how analytics teams run or are trying to run with Agile?
I mean, I think the Agile approach and how it encourages constant communication really helps with that. So for us, and again, we're just now starting to implement this on the analytics side, but before, you know, my team is staying very close with dotted lines to stakeholders in each department, checking in with them at least every other week. Before we kick off the sprint, we prioritize, you know, what we think are the priorities for the next 2 weeks, and review those with the founders of the company the day before we'll kick off the sprint. And they can kind of get a sense for capacity based on what we've pointed these tickets in a refinement session. So it's really just about like the constant communication, and then also being sure to communicate when something is complete and there is like a product to look at. So that's what we've seen success with so far.
That makes sense.
But making sure that everyone knows when we're deprioritizing this task, it's because we have these 5 other things. Like, would you agree that these are more important? 9 times out of 10, they'll agree.
That's fair. Do you think that you got to lean on some goodwill from implementing that process in engineering first as well, or was everyone on board for it in engineering too?
I think so. I think that helped.
Makes sense. I have opinions, but we have a room full of people. Has anyone else found anything super helpful in getting stakeholders on board? Or folks who have implemented it?
One thing that I think it's often the situation that the data team is working in an operation that has a larger software engineering team. And so if I'm giving advice to like data leaders, what I normally tell them is try as much as they can to keep whatever system they're using as similar as they can to the software engineering team. The software engineering team has probably done a lot of that heavy lifting on education.
Definitely.
If you're lucky, they're sort of doing a lot of that, and the rest of the organization will be used to the way that they talk about things. So as much as you can piggyback off of that in order to leverage that work that they're doing, the easier time that you're going to have, especially because you're sort of a smaller organization. I mean, again, this is sort of one of the reasons why I wrote this article was sort of coming out of that thought process of being like working with a bunch of engineers, wanting to copy their process, but then needing to figure out how to tweak it to make it work well for analytics and data science teams. And that's like was sort of really the motivation, was making it as easy as possible for my stakeholders to understand what the process was and how it's going to work in our organization, because it was very, very similar to what the software engineering team was doing.
Right. Agile and data it's like my favorite pet research project, because there's so much written, and we're really lucky in data. There's so much we can borrow from engineering, but then there's so much we have to say like, no, this is not what exists in our reality. And finding the right ways to communicate that and to challenge ourselves to push against it where, you know, we can work more efficiently. It's a practice. It's a constant practice, much like the rest of Agile. But yes, if engineering teams are already using some sort of Agile approach, it's definitely a good idea to lean on that. I'm right there with you.
I think it's super helpful to leverage that transparency to get goodwill. Like the data team is often understaffed and very highly appreciated, and people don't always know what your team is working on because it's very cross-functional and it's sort of a black box. And so using this as a way to give people transparency into here's what's ahead of us, here's what we're working on this week, here's what we're working on, here's what's next, like help me prioritize, looping in all the right people and kind of giving them the ability to actually see what's going on is also a really great way to kind of get that buy-in and support for changing the process.
Definitely. Plus the arguments for more headcount, as Michael was saying earlier.
we had done quarterly stakeholder meetings, or no, we did monthly actually, and pretty much invited anybody who had a project that they were looking to start, wanting to start, to come and kind of talk to us about it, and they could get a roadmap and understanding of what we were working on and kind of provide that visibility. We ended up, once kind of things got under control from a data side, we noticed that our stakeholders started just kind of tailing off and not attending our meetings anymore, and we ended up killing it. But we'll be reinstating those very shortly, because we've gotten back into that kind of issue where we're operating in a black box again, and unless they're looking at our Jira board, they don't know what we're working on. And unless we're evangelizing it, unless we're sending out emails, it's difficult. And I think that's kind of a core thing about analytics teams, is the need to evangelize and the need to talk to people about what you're doing, and especially if you're building data products for them to use. Evangelizing the work that your team does is the best way to get users. And
Yes.
I know that for us, that's a big thing, is that we're constantly building out different ways to help our users access their data. And it's like, if they're not even reading their emails, or we're not communicating clearly, it's difficult to get traction. So I think communication is a huge part of Agile, and talking to our sponsors and stakeholders about the work that we're doing.
Definitely. I think we're just over halfway through here. Should we switch gears a little bit to we've talked some about the challenges, but focusing on the bad / maybe some adjustments, things we can do to work around the challenges of Agile for data teams. What's my most challenging thing? I mean, data is not engineering, especially for a lot of things, but we already talked about that. If I could pick another one, I don't think it's the bad, I just think it's a really big challenge, is teaching folks who are used to, wanting to make the most complete solution to think about the smallest vertical slice, as it were, right? Like, what modeling work can we do? What presentation layer work can we do to get something done that is useful or communicative, or making sure that stakeholders understand what direction we're heading in, that doesn't leave them in the dark for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or however long it is. It's not a function of Agile that makes that hard, but to do Agile well, I think that's a special challenge for data teams, is scoping down to that, because maybe the first iteration is a table that shows your data set. And I mean, you can get something directional out of that is, oh, hey, I see you're using field X to describe this, but actually you should be using field Y. And if you're building a model on top of that, that sort of quick directional update can make a lot of difference in, did you waste a lot of time for the week coming up after that, or did you quickly redirect? So that's my sort of challenge in doing Agile well, and one of the ways that we think about working around it. What's on your what's on your list, Michelle?
Oh yeah, well that's interesting. That got me thinking that, that feels like something that should kind of come out of refinement and grooming, right? Because if you do decide to talk about what your approach to solving, or to, I guess, achieving an acceptance criteria, and you realize that now we're pointing this at like an 8 in terms of like a Fibonacci scale, okay, is there a way that we can pare this down? Because given like the priority of the organization, we shouldn't really be spending too much time on it. And so then coming up with that smaller task. Things that that are top of mind for me, and this might be getting a little outside of Agile similarly, is, so right now my team we're generalists, and, our priority backlog is a mixture of different things. So maybe there's a task related to operations or business intelligence or marketing. But as we do start to think about specializing and thinking about like the capacity of the full team, even though certain team members will be focusing on one department, like how do you pull stories in? If the top 10 items in the priority backlog are all related to marketing, and the team is not a team of generalists, but rather specialists, where one person knows absolutely nothing about marketing, how do you just, split up the capacity that you have for the next sprint based on the areas of focus? And this is like, again, kind of outside of Agile, but in just thinking about growing the team at Billy, I would imagine that some of your teams do specialize at this point. So that's just something that's on my mind. And if anybody has suggestions or thoughts, I'd be curious to hear them.
I mean, you say it's outside of Agile, but it seems pretty closely aligned. Like, will it work, or what adjustments do we need to make it work? That seems pretty relevant.
Yeah.
I think I read some teams' approach is to leave the sprint planning at the vertical level, right? So people who are deciding about marketing tickets are doing marketing things, people who are deciding about finance tickets are doing finance things, product, etc. But that's challenging if you're still having one resource pool, with the example that you gave of we mostly have marketing tickets right now. Yeah. And for me in that case, I think it's harder to vote for specializing too terribly much with individual team members. And I think maybe my more generalizable takeaway in those environments is we coach a lot of folks to have really good documentation, especially for the gotchas. Why did you calculate this way in this DBT model? Why is this sort of special set of filters built into the BI tool? What caveats should be included for someone who's reading this analysis report if somebody comes back to refresh it in 3 months? But I don't know. I wish I had a magic wand. How do other people think about that?
Cross-train.
Oh yes, rotations. I have heard of rotations.
We do it. Every single person who comes to my team gets a server rotation so that they learn admin and then they can be on call. And then they go on to their automation routine and learn automation so that they can understand and maintain scripts that we have written. And then they go into it. Then they finally can get into some of the analytics work. But everybody has to learn the ropes first.
So are the members of your team specialists, but they have the ability to be full stack? Is that the idea, or is everyone full stack?
Everybody comes in at a different level, but the idea is to get everybody to be a full stack engineer. The idea is that we tell them that this is not your last job. Come here and learn how to be a full stack engineer on my team. You'll learn what you need to be whoever you want to be and do where you want to be in your career. And then they all have an interest in learning, and they all have an interest in being. Everybody wants to be a full stack engineer.
I know.
If you offer that and you give them a pathway, they're more than happy to jump through the hoops that are necessary to get there. If they have a nice path for it.
Yeah, it's hard. Data's hard. There's a lot of context that's required. So when thinking about full stack, it just seems a little daunting for everyone to be able to jump in on any project. But I agree, and I have also seen that case where a lot of analysts want to work on everything, so they're willing to, do the work. Cool. What else? What other pain points are people experiencing with Agile or frustrations?
I have a question. Maybe this will launch another derivative conversation. Is there, Michael, you alluded to data science and some of the inherent sort of considerations over there. Is there given I'm new to this, is there a fundamental difference in the way we think about analytics versus data science with this lens? Because when I think about the duration of work for my data scientists versus my analytics engineers, the median timeline for analytics engineers is 2 weeks and change, and then a data scientist is 6 weeks and change. And so given that reality, what does that look like with the Agile lens?
So, I mean, the first thing that I would do is I would challenge that reality, right? If someone's telling me that it's going to take them 6 weeks to turn something around, I'm going to want to know a little bit more about what the intermediate results there are. What are they actually doing for those 6 weeks? And is there any way that we can cut it up into 3 2-week blocks? It might be the case that the project takes that long, but I would still expect that there will be some amount of intermediate results that could be shared over the course of that time. And this is one of those things that I think is challenging to work through. But this is where I actually really want to push data scientists, and where I think that we can actually make data scientists a lot more effective. I know this in myself with my own work. When I get more disciplined about spelling out what my intermediate deliverables are going to be and then making sure to stick to that, I do better work and I work much faster. Because otherwise I just like randomly am like querying things and being like, oh, this looks interesting. And I'll go and like look at it. And it's just like, I'm not actually making forward progress. But when instead I write down, I say like, okay, look, I'm going to look at what the distribution of this thing is. Then I'm going to repeat that broken down by these different groups. And I'm going to run a logistic regression and see if anything drops out. And then I do those things and then I put it into an R Markdown file and I share it with the team, right? Like that is like the first step in this like much longer process of doing this research, of figuring out if, you know, the model that I'm working on is going to be viable. But like that is one chunk of work right there, right? That's an initial chunk of work. I can look at it, I can review the results, I can decide if like that's going to change what the next 2 weeks is going to look like, or if I'm going to continue on the same path. Or maybe someone on my team is going to look at it and be like, oh, look, like this, you know, this distribution looks really weird. You're going to need to make sure that you're accounting for that, whatever, right? And so like, I actually see this problem a lot where a lot of data scientists like really want to like go and like work on their own thing and not like talk to anyone for a long time. And I really always try to push back on that desire to do that, because I actually don't think it's healthy and I don't think that it's the most productive way to work. And so the more that you can encourage those scientist types to think about like, what's the hypothesis? What's my action plan? Sort of getting into that like lab notebook, writing down like what your experiment is, what the results were, and then sharing that out, I think the better off you're going to be. So I think that like, that's my initial reaction just to hearing that, is that like, it doesn't actually have to be that way. A lot of data scientists, like I hear them all the time claim that it has to be that way. And I'm just like, that doesn't make sense to me. I don't think that that's true. And so, you know, that is the first thing that I would look at. I do think there, again, you know, I think the big difference between like engineering work and research work is that like engineering work, right? You're building a bridge, you have a blueprint, there's like formulas that you can apply to know how much, you know, weight that bridge is going to hold. That is very much engineering work. Research work does not work that way, right? Like there's no blueprint. You're out there asking questions. You know, there's the acceptance criteria is not like a working product, right? But so then the question that I ask is like, what can acceptance criteria look like in the research context? And that's where I start talking about these things of like, I'm going to produce a report that's going to have these graphs in it, and then we're going to look at them, interpret them, and decide what that means, and figure out what that means for the next story that's going to be written, or what that means for the direction of the project. And so like, that's how I think about this world, and that's where the difference is. The difference is in sort of what the deliverables look like, but not necessarily the approach to how you structure the work and go about making sure that you're making forward progress. Does that make sense? Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, all that's helpful. Thank you. Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. Anybody else have any thoughts there?
The other thing that I just learned over time was like, even if you know what the right answer is at like a data science perspective, maybe you've seen another company write about it, you know it's this particular model, but it will take you 6 weeks to really get that fully functioning and ready to go. Maybe the answer is don't do that model first, even if you know that's like the gold standard. Maybe it's like, just get your first cut over of anything that gets us directionally correct. Because usually along the way, there's a bunch of setup that goes into even your final model. So like, even if the code's out in the wild, things just don't plug and play the way we expect them, and we wish they always do. Yeah, we were more disciplined and just being forced that like, you know what the gold standard is, we're not going to do that today because we can't execute that in 2 weeks, 3 weeks time. Sorry,
or
Michael.
Even, you know, no, I'm sorry for interrupting you. That was my bad. I was just going to tack on and say like, the modeling process, I think most, you know, people who do it professionally will always tell you like, you always want to start with the simplest model, right? Like you don't ever want to jump into the one that has like 90 parameters and is like hierarchical and like, you know, what it has all the crazy splines in it. Right? You actually want to start with something simpler. And so if you're a data scientist and like, this is the direction that we're going, it's going to take 6 weeks to get there. I'm like, well, I would actually like to see the results at week 1 where you do the simple model and then like write out like, okay, we're going to start with the simple logistic. Then we're going to add in the hierarchical levels. Then we're going to, and like, you can sort of spell out what that's going to look like. And these are things that like a lot of the data scientists are planning on doing anyway in their head, or if they aren't, like they probably should be. And so it's just like, get them to think about it ahead of time, break it down, and then like move that sort of into this agile process with stories where it's documented. And so that way other people can see what's happening and play along. And so I think a lot of it is just like taking what people are already doing or should be doing or like claim that they're doing and like actually putting just a little bit more structure around it.
And I think the last thing to tack onto that, Michael, was spillover of that sort of work forces them to think about how I could reuse the things I'm going to build in this week's time to next week's time. And usually that's really the blocker for getting any like hacky model into something more, I wouldn't say production, because like we rarely ever get to a state of full production models, but like to get a bit more reliability, you have to guarantee some sort of like structure and rigidity. And if you know you're going to keep spinning your wheels on this and there are checkpoints, then you think a bit more consciously, how could I build this in a way that makes it easy for me to pick up 2 weeks later and then sort of like tweak and edit. And so you force modular thinking a bit more.
Yeah, we often, I mean, and I think you'll see a lot as you're digging into more resources, we're often asking people like, really, what is the MVP? Like I said earlier, what's that smallest meaningful slice that we can get done? You know, what can we communicate about? What did we learn today? What did we see in the data? Whatever that is. Just getting people to think in those smaller and smaller chunks. It's hard for a lot of people. Like people feel fundamentally uncomfortable. And I think maybe another thing that will help those folks as you push them to break up the really big projects is like saying it's okay to say there are caveats. You know, like what will it mean in 2 weeks to show some output of some model? It's just the direction we're going. It's not what we're finally going to end up with. You know, what will it say in 2 weeks to show the functioning wireframe of this dashboard, as opposed to, you know, necessarily having every perfect piece of data and every little thing figured out. So it takes practice, but it can be nice once you start getting into that good workflow. It feels good once you start getting feedback and other teams see the value, but it takes some time to get there.
I had a quick question if no one else has a maybe better question. I feel like coming on your last 10 minutes always feels pressuring to give a question.
Go for it.
But the one thing I just wanted to add to that was I think it's also interesting because we tend to forget a lot of the things you discover in the experimental phase of data science tends to be super meaningful for the rest of the business. Like I've worked with people personally who have discovered caveats in the data, realize that that model doesn't work or that path doesn't work, and they pivot 180, but forget to share what they figured out in the organization. And like maybe it's not useful for you as a data scientist, but you're a data analytics team who had like a preconceived notion of how something worked could just be like completely changed. And so I think the cadence of sharing this information, even if it's not a good model, is helpful. And also like for your future scientists to never try the same thing again because you've already done it once, one and done. The question I did have that kind of spurred from that, I guess in the same vein, is it seems like everyone's convinced that it's a good idea to kind of jump into the deep end of the Agile like methodology and framework. Have you seen people change the way they ask questions? I'd say I'm pretty sure people have stories on like the good of like people have become more detailed and like sort of like focused in when they ask questions. But have you also seen people maybe play it a bit too safe when they start writing in like tickets that they know it has to be more scoped? And so as a team, you feel like you're doing less innovative work because like those tickets seem to be harder to write or harder to concretize. And so you end up like in this spiral of very small incremental changes that might not snowball into something more meaningful. This is me playing devil's advocate, of course, and like the opposite end of the spectrum of like, has anyone seen it and what are
I definitely have. So I love that question because I think it's really important. And Caitlin, I think, recently published a blog post where she took a slightly different angle on this, where she was talking about sort of the incremental tasks versus some of the researchy tasks, which I think is a great blog post. Everyone should go read it. And this is the thing that I thought a lot about as well, because I think you're right that like what you end up doing, well, if you get like sort of good at this, right, you get into the point where like you do the things that are easy to point, the things that like clearly show value, and you don't do the other things. And I think it's a really hard question. What I did as like a leader on the team was I emphasized having sort of more like research-oriented stories, which again were like, the story was like, look into this thing and like produce a report, right, that summarizes your findings. And so, you know, I think that's a place again where you take a little bit more like looser view of like what the traditional software engineering, agile, like functioning software looks like. It's like, we're not actually producing functioning software, but we're producing knowledge. right? And so we actually need to make sure that we're carving out time within each sprint to have a story or a couple of stories where we're actually going to pursue some like knowledge increasing activity where the result isn't necessarily functioning code or a new feature or a new dashboard, but like someone who's actually doing research and thinking about things, and hopefully that, you know, it may or may not, right? It might yield nothing. It might yield a bunch of new ideas. We don't really know. That's the sort of thing with research. Like we as a team are going to collectively agree that that's a thing that we're going to invest in.
And do you get like buy-in from like heads and whatever to be like 25% of our time will be research and may or may not yield something? Like how do you structure that with the large organizations?
That's what I did. I mean, you know, I spent, when I was doing this, I don't think I was particularly good at it, but like I really tried really hard at it. It was like I spent a lot of time trying to get buy-in that this is a thing worth doing. And you know, that's a hard thing to navigate. It's going to vary by like who's in leadership at each different organization, and you're going to have to sort it out. I mean, I really believe that it's important for organizations to have like an R&D type function on the data side. Once you get to like a certain scale, I think like, you know, at very small scale, this very obviously needs to happen. But once you get to a certain size, like you can really unlock value by having R&D. And then I think when you're pitching that function, you need to describe like there's going to be some losses, right? R&D is, you know, it's like a 1 in 10, 1 in 100 sort of thing. We're going to have to do a lot of research. Occasionally we'll get a lot of value out of it, but a lot of times we'll get none. And like we just have to make sure that we're continually investing in that and doing that. And if we don't do that, like we're going to, you know, lose the advantage that we have. We're not going to catch up to our competitors. Like those are that sort of investment I think is actually important to go about doing. And I think it can be a very hard case to make depending on who you're talking to, but I actually think it's important, and as leaders in analytics, I think it's an important thing to do.
Two ways I've seen this play out. Where I work, we borrow from the Google concept of 20% time, which is similar, like we're budgeting out some research time. And at another company I worked at, once a quarter, we had 2 weeks where engineering and data just worked on some project we wanted to work on. I think we ultimately ended up alternating between a more maintenance and tech debt cleanup focused one and a more research and open-ended focused one, which there often can be overlap between those. Like clean up tech debt and build some automation that keeps us from having to do that in the future. That can be really nice, and that's another example of cases where how can you borrow from the similarities between engineering and data to really, move something forward. If the whole engineering team is not taking as many meetings in a week, it could be nice to kind of get the data team tacked onto that as well. Oh, sorry, what was that?
Oh, I was just saying super helpful, thanks.
Of course. You also reminded me about Michelle's first point about acceptance criteria and asking about the why. Like this kind of points back to, okay, we're playing it safe, we're making this really small ticket. Like, does adding this chart, does building this model like really make sense for what we're doing? Kind of getting back to those big picture pieces, I think can help as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So many good questions. I guess we're at the last 3 minutes. Am I counting my time here correctly? Any last good ones for the road?
I'll say thank you all. This was a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Yeah,
this is really
thanks
fun.
everyone for contributing.